And welcome everyone to episode 19. My name is Dr. Jennifer Walinga, and I'm a professor at Rose University. And we are so pleased to see so many people joining us today and so many registrants who will then see the recording afterwards. So I want to welcome you all, and of course, welcome our special guest, Rose Mercier. We want to always begin at Rose by acknowledging and thanking the Lekwungen and Kwistutsun First people on whose unceded territories we live and learn, work, and play. We honor the ancestors, supernatural ones, hereditary leaders, and matriarchs. We always want to acknowledge that acts of colonization have occurred and try to fill the gaps in our history by taking responsibility, acknowledging the truth before reconciliation. We all have a responsibility in fostering that kind of partnership and understanding. I also spend a lot of time on the Wasanich territories, on the lake, on the waters, and going backwards in this skinny little boat. And this little boat teaches me something every morning. I was out in it this morning, in fact, and I literally learn a principle that guides me through the day each time I spend time in this very tippy, but beautifully rhythmic boat. And I like to highlight the fact that there is truth. There is truth in sport. I devote a lot of time to sport, of course. There's so much learning that can be gained. And when we talk about sport, I always want to remind people that I work with in this context to lean on the knowledge that you've gained from your sport. It possesses so many principles and concepts that can help us solve the problems that we face. We also spend a lot of time learning from the lands on which our campus resides, spending a lot of time looking at the ecological systems that surround us, and again, learning the truths, leaning on that knowledge and understanding. And I always like to highlight this little bridge that's on the campus. It's an emblem of our school, the School of Communication and Culture. It is a beautiful metaphor for us because it represents the importance of minding the gaps before bridging the gaps. Our school is called the School of Communication and Culture for a reason. In order to understand one another, in order to bridge that understanding with a structure or a handshake or a hug or a conversation, we need to first understand our differences, just like you would when you're constructing a concrete bridge, right? Where you would understand both sides before you can actually construct it. Also want to highlight the purpose behind this webinar is really to highlight the power of sport, to teach us and to really represent, because it is a bit of a microcosm of humanity, but it's also a huge engagement tool of humanity. So many people participate in sport in so many different ways, not just as an athlete or a coach. There's so many ways to participate in sport. And it's truly a magnificent engagement tool, but it also, as we've seen, it also represents an avenue for change and possesses a great deal of power and platform. Increasingly, I think our athletes, I'm so proud of them for recognizing the power that they really have to influence positive change in the world. Our schools at Royal Rose represent, I think, a lot of the same concepts that sport focuses on or tries to support: development, diversity and inclusion, education, environment, equity and human rights, health, communication, and peace. And we also try to partner with sport organizations, but that's really grounded in our belief in flexible learning, flexible assessment of prior learning, and that understanding that our learners are all bringing prior learning into the academic sphere. So whether it's sport or music or family or community or whatever your context, you're bringing a great deal of learning into the cohort and into the learning community. And we've partnered with a number of sport organizations in creating leadership and learning opportunities for athletes and leaders within sport as well. Recently, we offered a course to the CFL Players Association on leadership development. A fabulous experience for me to work with these kinds of young men. And that really is the seed or the kernel of real hope and insight into sport and leadership and social change, the way these intersect. And so that began the webinar series a couple of years ago as we were all entering the Zoom world during COVID. And here we are at episode 19, where we'll be looking deeply into sport governance in Canada. What makes sport a unique realm of governance? What are the unique governance needs of sport? And of course, our guest is Rose Mercier. I'll introduce her in a moment. I'll ask her to share more about herself as well. But I remind you all that throughout the webinar, we have an hour and a half together to please post questions or comments in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as we go. And we always love to hear from you. We'll also see if there's time at the end. Sometimes we can invite you to turn your mic on, turn your camera on, and share a little bit of what your reflections are or questions that you might have as well. And now let's introduce the woman of the hour here. Rose Mercier is a governance professional, and she coaches boards, policy boards, on implementing policy governance. She's had a great deal of experience in management, program development, leadership training, mostly with nonprofit organizations. She herself has been a CEO of national sport organizations in Canada. She's a background in sport and a master's in business administration, but she's also highly credentialed and qualified as a coach of boards and an author. And I, of course, met Rose and started following her through her blog that's highlighted on SIRC, the Sport Information Research Council. And I was just so impressed, and she's been helping me without realizing it for so many years. So it was a wonderful opportunity to invite her in. And with that, and I also remind you, try and stay in touch, because we probably won't come back to my PowerPoint at the end. So I always like to highlight contacts for our guests and ourselves here at Rural Roads. Please stay in touch and highlight that. Our next one, going to be exploring measures of good, safe, quality sport. How do we know if we're doing safe sport well? And with that, I'll stop sharing and introduce you to our guest, Rose. Welcome, Rose. It's so wonderful to see you. And I really appreciate all the time that you're devoting and donating to me today and to us. And as you can see, a lot of people are interested to hear what you have to say and the wisdom you have to share. It's great to see some friends online here. I can recognize so many names. And so, Rose, I always want to start by expanding on the introduction. You know, I can give a few little points and people can find out information online, but can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background, of course, in governance, but also in sport? Like, why sport for you? What's drawn you to sport? Why do you continue to devote much of your work to the world of sport?
Okay. I've also seen a lot of people I know. So I was sharing with Jennifer this. I was getting ready for this. I started getting very nervous by seeing the number of people said, "Oh, I'm signing up. I'm signing up," and I'm going like, "Okay, you better be ready." So hopefully the preparation serves us well. So my history in sport is started. I actually was 10 years old. I was walking by a swimming pool and I saw people swimming up and down the lanes. And I thought, what are they doing? I want to do that. And my dad said, okay, let's do that. And so that was the start of my tenure in sport. I competed in swimming. Eventually I competed in athletics. I coached swimming. I moved across the country in the interim. I started a career in sport administration with the now extinct Sports Federation of Canada. I was there for 3 years, and then I spent 8 years as the director of coaching education with Swim Canada, 7 years as the CEO of Cycling Canada. I did a short stint with what was then fitness and amateur sport in the International Sports and Major Games Unit. Found out I wasn't a big fan of working in the government. So anybody's in government, I have lots of good friends who have worked in those directorates and departments, but just didn't work for me. I also then spent some time as director of the Tate McKenzie Leadership Institute within the now extinct, there's a pattern here, Sports and Fitness Administration Center. It focused on leadership. It kind of ran out of funding. And I thought, you know what, I want to work on my own. So I guess also in the sport years, I was quite involved in women in sport. I was the founding mother of what was then CAUSE, but which is now Canadian Women in Sport, and we were doing fabulous work. I worked with the Women in Coaching program, the Canada Games, Commonwealth Games, women's apprentice coach programs. So lots of leadership development work at that time. And then so when I started in my, decided, yeah, I've always wanted to work for myself anyway. It was pretty natural to just start doing work in sport. And that I probably the first 13 years of my consulting career, it's called the first half and the second half about now. I really, some of that time I focused on board governance. But it was almost always was national, provincial, territorial, some local sport organizations, some multi-sport organizations, some boards, but a lot of management projects as well. I did lots of strategic planning and whatnot, but I started to do some more board governance work at the end. I also did 3 stints as an interim CEO. So sport is pretty much in my psyche, right? Like it's always been a part of my life. And even though I'm not, not as integrally involved in sport, it doesn't leave me. I mean, I read Cirque every day. I read all of the newsletters and etc. So I kind of know what's going on. So I always say, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I understand governance, not as involved in sport anymore, and so I think that's important. But yeah, and I guess the thing is, you don't stay involved in something you're not passionate about. And I really, your words resonated with me. I believe and have always believed that sport plays an important role in Canadian culture and for Canadians of any age. So yeah.
Right. So powerful. Beautiful. And what an inspiration. I'm just sitting here thinking, wow, to have all of those perspectives must be so valuable. I'm sure it infuses the work that you do with any organization. It doesn't have to be sport. So thinking about governance, what would you say are kind of the key elements of good governance, effective, successful? What does it need to have for it to be?
Okay. Yeah, this was a hard question to think about because I have a lot to say about this. So interrupt me as I go. It's probably helpful to give a bit of context to this, to my thinking about this, is that, as I said, probably in the first part of my career, maybe a third of the work that I was doing was with boards. But since 2009, I've been working as part of the governance coach consulting team. Our only business is board governance. And in the 27 years, which is pretty amazing, since the governance coach was founded, we've worked with over 500 boards in organizations that range widely in terms of size and type and complexity or simplicity, but just a full gamut. And what we've really do is work with their boards and help them be able to provide clear, focused direction that leads to organizational success. And I think so. The definition, there's lots of definitions, but I think this one works really well, which is that if you think of governance as a system by which the whole of the organization is directed, controlled, and held accountable to achieve its core purpose over the longer term. It gives you some sense of it is a very fundamental component of organizational success. And we often forget that, or we don't appreciate the comprehensiveness or the complexity of governance. So working with that many organizations over a long period of time, we've learned a lot about governing boards. All right. And so we've been putting a lot of that to work, if you will, is that we have a fundamental belief is that boards at their heart want to shape a meaningful future for their organization that they're governing. But in order to make that happen, we've really identified there's 3 key outcomes that a board needs to achieve. The first of these is role clarity, where there's a clear understanding of respective roles of the board and the CEO. And I'll use CEO, and it could be whatever that term is, executive director, whatever, but I'll use CEO as the short form of that. So the roles of the board and the CEO and how they interface, if you will, is clearly understood. And that makes it possible for there to be clear accountability from the board to the staff, and in turn from the board to those on whose behalf it's governing. And we'll talk a lot about those on whose behalf it's governing this afternoon, I think. The second key outcome that a board needs is risk management, where the organization is protected, right? Where all of its assets are proactively protected by ensuring that there's a robust process to manage risk in place. Right? Certainly sport has paid attention to the notion of risk management, et cetera. I will probably talk about this in a way I think for me is a bit more comprehensive. And also thinking about the roles of the board and the CEO related to risk, because they're different. And the third component or outcome that a board needs to achieve is really future focus, where it's possible to set a long-term future direction for the organization. So, I mean, those might seem obvious and would say, yeah, okay, that's great, but so what? And I think if we dig into these a little bit, what I think is reality is that these outcomes don't come about without some real discipline and some real, a really informed perspective about how to make those happen. So if you think about role clarity and future focus, they're really driven by principles-based governance. And by that, I mean, boards need, we talked about it's a system. I fundamentally believe that boards need a conceptually coherent system for governance that embraces all of the relevant aspects of the organization or all of the relevant, if you will, aspects of governance in some kind of sensible whole. So if you need to be able to tailor, right, your governance systems as the organization evolves. And if what you're using is, as I call it, a compendium of best practices, what happens is you don't have a way of going back and go, well, does this fit or not fit anymore? If you're using principles-based governance, like, okay, we can do things differently as we grow in size or as the context in which we're operating changes, because you can go back to the principles and go like, okay, what's the principle here, right? So if one of the principles is the board holds authority as a whole, and that it makes decisions as a whole, right? Like you understand, okay, what's problematic when we have, committees that are making decisions, on their own, et cetera. So it really is, it's important because you need to be able to move away from, as I call it, the thinking in analogies, right? Like, so best practices come from, okay, what do we need to do? Well, this board is doing this, or a lot of boards are doing that, and so we should apply this. And while that might work in the short term, it doesn't necessarily prepare you to meet the future. So there's just a different way of thinking about it. So I think that idea of principles-based governance is really fundamental.
Can I just push a
Yeah.
little more on that concept of principles-based? And you use the example of making a decision as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And so what would be the principle governing that? Why would that be an important principle to uphold if a board has decided it is?
So boards are given the authority to govern, right? Usually always in a set of bylaws that say the board will do this. And if you'll see most organizations in their bylaws will say the board is given the authority to manage the whole of the organization, to operate or to govern, or the bylaws will change a little bit, is to say that it's accountable for the use of that authority. So it starts out as the body with all of the authority, and it can delegate that authority, but it's still accountable for all of the authority it delegates. And if what the board does is to delegate its authority, and I often use this with committees, is that it delegates away authority to make a decision, and the board as a whole is not actually making that decision, then what you've done is you've kind of bifurcate the authority. And so what you want to be able to do is to say, if you have, it's perfectly legitimate to have board committees that help the board do its job, which we'll talk about, but you want them to support the board in its decision making, not make decisions on its own. So yeah. So it doesn't, like you can create varieties of ways of working. I mean, we've worked with organizations that have, two Co-CEOs, not something I recommend, but, you know, co-CEOs are newly started up, and they've got committees that are doing both, as I call it, operational work and governance work. And it can be pretty tricky, but if you always go back to, okay, how does the board, how do we continue to implement board holism here as a principle? So, okay, so when we talk about what drives role clarity and risk management, so if you look at those together, and they're really driven by, so I call them empowering policies. And these only exist, all right, when first the board sets out unambiguous expectations that comprehensively address every aspect of the organization, and that they're written down and they're systematically constructed. Okay, so it's not policies that are just a list of things, like they have 25 items or 25 statements, and some of the statements have smaller statements, but it really starts with, if you will, the largest value related to that particular policy, and that the board writes in further detail, wants to say a little bit more, so it writes in further detail what that policy is intended, either results to be achieved or boundaries to be observed. And so that becomes part of the unambiguity, if you will. It's not really a word, but we'll make it one for today. The second thing that's needed for empowering policies is that the board specifies expected results, and it specifies limits of management authority or staff authority or CEO authority, whatever you want to call that, so that the CEO is confident that they have the authority to apply their expertise and experience within those limits to achieve results without having to play, as I call it, the mother may I form of governance, which is, can I do this? Yes, you can. This is what I'm thinking I'm doing. What do you think? Oh, we think it's good. And you go back and forth, but you know that you can, apply. Like I often say, why do you spend all the time and money to hire a competent CEO if you're not going to give them the flexibility to apply their experience and expertise? Not without the appropriate checks and balances, but you want policies to be empowering. That's what they are. And that's really the third element of empowering, is that the board needs to be very systematic and rigorous in ensuring that its policies are actually being followed. So it can be confident that it's delegating its authority, but it's not abdicating its fiduciary responsibilities. So that's the other part that helps form role clarity and risk management. And then if you look at how do you achieve future focus and risk management, what helps drive those, and that's really context awareness, which means that the board needs to develop risk acumen, as I call it, which means is that the boards need to be confident that they understand the extent, the significance of not only current risks, but also future risks to the organization. And that happens only because the board's deliberately identified and studied trends and factors that create future risk. And it's similar to thinking about, the board also needs a compelling vision. It needs to forge that through a really fulsome exploration of a wide spectrum of alternative futures, and the application of, insightful imagination and uncommon wisdom to commodities which are not always in generous supply. So I think, finally, boards need to, as part of context awareness, need to develop leadership, which you talk a lot about, because you want that leadership to make sure that the organization is going to be relevant and thrive in the long term, and that leadership is really fit for purpose today and in the future. So when you're thinking about who are we recruiting to the board, what are we doing in terms of board development and education? How expert are we becoming in governance and what that demands of us? So as I always say, is that the elements of good governance, I don't think good governance is a high enough standard. I think, athletes and all of those that are involved in sport deserve exemplary governance. So that's, yeah. A little bit. Yeah, we've learned a lot in those 3 decades, right, about the levels of board performance. And I think what we've tried to do of late is that we know that board performance is like a lot of human performance or human behaviors. It really aligns along a bell curve that you can identify kind of levels of board performance. We've now calling them zones, and we've used the kind of traffic lights to help us, if you will, categorize. And it's really the degree to which the board has achieved role clarity or risk management or future focus. And so if you think about where boards lie along that sort of bell curve, and the majority of boards that we encounter fall into what we call the amber zone, where boards are really acting as guardians of the association that they're governing. So there's role overlap, so there isn't that absolute role clarity. And that, honestly, that is the first thing people say to me, is that role clarity? Yeah, no, it doesn't happen. It's just not that clear. So there isn't role clarity, or there's role overlap, which often leads to confusion, to lost opportunities, to frustration. I mean, I've, worked in enough organizations to go like, yeah, it's not fun to be a CEO in an organization where it's not clear who has the authority to do what, or it changes from week to week or situation to situation. The other thing that happens in that amber zone is risk management tends to be CEO plan and board approved. And that's often with planning as well, as it the CEO leads and the board goes, yeah, that works for us. And that what you've got are strategic plans, but not really strategic foresight. Like, you're not thinking far enough into the future to understand that how to make decisions today that will position the organization to thrive in the future and to be able to function in an entirely different context. And I mean, my guess is, without having, and this is without having looked in depth at, all the NSOs and PTSOs or local leagues, I'm going to guess that most boards fall into that, amber kind of category.
And building on that, the idea, I'm going to ask you about this phrase of noses in but fingers out, or how do we separate operations from governance? Because that's often a discussion, I would say, and it leans in on this idea of role clarity. But you talk about role clarity comes with limitations, empowerment, but also this accountability, checks and balances. And so how do we establish those? And so maybe thinking about this concept of how do we have this oversight, but without doing the CEO's job or hovering above him or her very horribly.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this idea of noses in, fingers out, one of the things we have to always be cautious about is phrases, right, that simplistically define what I think is something pretty complex to do. But I mean, simplistically, right, that might describe a board that understands its job is to set direction by specifying results or the impact to be achieved by the organization, establishes the limits of ethics and prudence within which the CEO is expected to achieve those results, and then systematically monitors to assure organizational performance, but doesn't get in the trenches, right, so to speak. So it doesn't help, it doesn't set up board committees in areas of management that it's delegated to the CEO. I mean, why does it have a personnel committee or a human resources committee? Why does it have financial management? Why does it have program communication or marketing? I mean, those are things that you've delegated to the CEO to do. You've said, make this happen, try not to, don't do anything unethical, imprudent, and, unlawful, obviously. But so it's, you end up, if you will, it's not very clear. So you end up with a situation where lots of ways that we can compromise that idea is that, you take back authority from the CEO. You've already delegated for high performance. So you start helping them do that because you have some experience in that. So, I mean, so that being said, I mean, I probably prefer phraseology. It's like the board needs to have its arms around the organization without getting its fingers in. And so I like this phrasing better. And the reason for that is I think that it reflects the board's accountability for the whole of the organization. I mean, the board's job is doing, if you will, hands-on work that enables it to govern, not to manage. So it should be engaging with, as I call them, the stakeholders that are really the shareholders. I mean, we do talk about this a little bit when my notion of, there are lots of stakeholders in sport, but there's a primary reference stakeholder, and that's really the members of the organization. And I sometimes use that notion of shareholders and members or clients, et cetera, or customers to kind of differentiate roles. So I'll talk about them as shareholders. So that's one of their jobs is engage with them to understand what their values are, and to then translate those values and those priorities into written policy that specify what impact or result, what should be happening because we exist, right? Because we're here today, what difference are we making in the world? And the other thing is it should be doing the work that assures that organizational performance is happening through that systematic, rigorous, monitoring, whatever you want to do, of whether have results been achieved and have they been achieved within those boundaries, and not just, don't give me activity reports, give me data, give me evidence that says this is what this looks like operationally, and here's the proof that actually is happening. And so that's that kind of, that's why it's kind of arms around, right? Like you need to make sure that all that the organization might do or produce, the board has spoken to, but it doesn't then need to go and help the CEO do the work. Right.
And I love the image, because it feels the same as in education, where there can be this understanding that as a professor, I've got my red pen and I'm sort of hovering and criticizing, but actually my role is arms around, supporting by creating clear criteria and outcomes for the athlete, for the student or coach would do, right?
Yeah.
To aspire to, and then creating all the supports to enable them to do that.
Yeah.
I've seen that in your writing as well. So the arms around is a beautiful,
And I think it's, you do that work, and I would say there's probably implicit limitations in that, is like, make this happen, learn this, without plagiarizing, without having someone else write your report, without kind of just, not doing the work, right? So it's not quite the same, but there are, implicit. And I think board governance just requires that the board make those limitations explicit. So it's very clear what they consider to be imprudent and unethical. The other thing I want to say just about the shortening of, when we use, noses, is it noses in, fingers up, whatever your term, or lots of people will talk about hands-off governance, et cetera. I think that it sometimes can lead to not very good interpretations of what's meant by that. So if governing isn't really hands-off, it's hands-off can be a way that leads to being very uninvolved in the control over staff, or where the board, stays out of the CEO's hair because, it's the CEO knows best, and it's the staff work. And so the problem with that, and we've seen this, I was reading about Laurentian University yesterday and going like, this type of manner of governance leads to some really colossal governance failures, both inside and outside of sport. And that results in jeopardizing an organization's, fiscal and reputational assets, and sometimes even their ability to continue to exist. I mean, I have a file in my computer called governance failures. And so I usually just drop in when I read stories, et cetera. And it's really full. So it's kind of why I prefer talking about arms around. Well, actually, I add to this kind of hands-off, arms around, eyes ahead, which really says, here's what the board needs to be doing, looking into the future.
And so what about sport organizations? Is it a unique realm, or is it, do you see it parallel to something like education, or?
Yeah.
It's a big one.
So it is interesting, right? And it's, I think if I gave you $1 for every organization I worked with that said, we're really unique, I'd be really rich. Or our governance is really unique. We need to be unique because we're unique. And every organization is unique. Every context is unique. But if you think about this as governance is a principle-based activity, is what you do is you tailor it, right? to the context. But you need to pay attention. So there's some things you pay attention to significantly when you look at organizations. And for me, probably one of the most significant things to pay attention to in sport organizations is that they're federations. And that means they're an organization of organizations that comprise the membership. And so what I sometimes start with is this statement. We've actually had the first part of this, and it comes from if you will, is a document called the Code of Practice for Delivering Effective Governance of Organizations. It was published by the British Standards Institute probably in about, I'm trying to think now, 2000. There's actually a new standard coming out that's published by ISO that is the standard for governance. It's been accepted by 80 countries around the world, and it's taken a lot from the British standards, and it's really, I think in my world, seen as probably one of the most, the best, if you will, references for thinking about governance. So what it says is that a governance body is directly accountable, we've already said this, for the long-term direction and control of the whole of the organization to certain stakeholders whose relationship with the organization is actually, or is equivalent to that of, if you will, shareholders. That they're, and I use this as saying, it's not just people who invest money, it's the people who invest their, if you will, their time and their treasure and their souls. So you've got and I think that's true of members of sport organizations. And so that relationship arises either out of a legal duty of accountability. So that's why I always go back to bylaws and go like, who hires and fires your board? Because that will tell you, if you will, who the shareholders are in an organization. So either, so that accountability is either in the organization's founding documents, or there can be sort of, if you will, a moral duty of accountability that's acknowledged by a governing body. It's a little more complex. I'm probably not going to dig into that too much today. But so for me, it's pretty easy in a sport organization to identify the stakeholders to whom the board is directly accountable for the long-term direction of the whole of the organization. And I think by and large, it ends up being its member provincial territorial organizations. Sometimes they're clubs, sometimes there's regional associations, but it's really, as I always say, is it who hires and fires the board, and who grants them, who through that document of bylaws delegates the authority to the board to govern on their behalf. And so that, members are entitled to vote at the annual meeting, and it's both basic, hire and fire the board. And those same board members authorize the board to govern the organization on their behalf. So it's pretty common. Like I've read it, and I think this happened because a lot of organizations, a lot of NSOs changed their bylaws at the same time. I did some of that too, and it says something, but except or is otherwise provided by the act or these bylaws, the board shall exercise all powers of the corporation, except those which the act expressly reserves for members, and may delegate any of its powers, duties, and functions. So it's saying, here's the authority to make this organization, relevant today, thrive in the future, not do anything, as I call it, imprudent or unethical, and make that happen because that's that you owe us that. And so, I mean, the challenge here, however, this would be simple, right? If those same, as I'll now call them shareholders, the PTSO clubs, whatever, like depending on the organization, but the member shareholders are also the beneficiaries of the organization's program, services, and activities. And in most conversations that you have with those shareholders, they're not shareholders, they're being customers, because we're using, right? We're using programs, we're using things. And so things aren't here on time. And when is the next, coaching program happening? And what is this? And so we're interested here. My interest here is short-term and me. And so we don't often have conversations about, that focus on the good of the whole of the organization over the longer term. And as we know, like any, if you have an agenda, the thing that takes up the most time are the immediate noisy concerns. And I mean, both of those are legitimate interests, but only one set of those interests belongs at the board table, and that's long-term shareholder interests. And so that's really fundamental. I mean, boards, I've said this on a few reports that I've written. I don't think they've been listened to, but anyways, that boards need to consult with members so that it develops a really deep understanding of their values, their priorities, their perspectives about what results should this organization produce, and what risks are there to the organization in producing those results, and what do you consider to be unethical and imprudent in the way that that's happened. So it doesn't include the board engaging with other stakeholders, because there's a lot of them in sport, all right? But that form of engagement still should be future focused, right? And so if you've got the board as a whole on behalf of the membership as shareholders, that needs to translate those into clearly defined purpose and expectations that, guides not just the CEO, or others that the board delegates to, but also directs the board, right? So this is what we expect of the board. Translate that into how the board describes its job, how it decides, what discipline do we need to impose upon ourselves. But yeah, so it's more immediate. It's very easy to get distracted by that, particularly if it shows up at the board table. And I think that's where, I mean, many of the NSOs that I'm familiar with have done some hard work about trying to disentangle. And I think that, Not-for-Profit Corporations Act was a good step of saying you can't, if you're the president of the association, you can't immediately have a seat on the board. So you got rid of that sort of ex officio kind of director, which was very useful, because I think it was pretty, in my early lifetime to have, 13 presidents around the board, and they all had all their interests, but they weren't, long-term shareholder interests. They were what's happening for me and my members today. And so easy to get off track, and you end up getting, you have individual concerns. I mean, so you need to be really thoughtful about, how do we mitigate against those circumstances? Because in some instances, there's a lot of smaller organizations where the people who step up to lead hold different roles. But how do you make sure that they're keeping, if you will, what role they ought to be playing as a board member when they're sitting around the board table? And I think, yeah, so that's one thing that I think is unique, is that federated structure, and the fact that the shareholders are also really clearly beneficiaries and users and participants. And so those interests often get kind of in this great large, jigsaw puzzle. And you're going, actually, we need the painting. That's what we're concerned about, is the longer term picture, and how do we keep on track of that.
And to your point of the 13 presidents, then you just have this round table of competing interests instead of keeping that representative. So having a representative of the 13 maybe at the board table.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that shortcut sometimes is that, and we did this. I've seen this also happen where you've got, an athlete member, right? So you've got a national team a national team athlete on the board. It shortcuts, or it sometimes gives an excuse to a board to not necessarily consider a broader range of input, that having a person who, one person can't represent the diversity and differences of opinion that exist in a province, or across across coaches or across athletes. And so I always say, it's like, it doesn't help to have just one. You can't presume that person represents that. Right. So you need to, as a board, like, fundamental job number one, talk to the people on whose behalf you're governing and find out what's important to them, and then translate it into direction and control and boundaries.
And how has that worked well, in your opinion? What's the process for actually gathering that?
Well, it's so one is that it is an ongoing job. All right. There are a lot of ways to do that, whether it's, conversations, it's whether it's focus groups or it's surveys or it's, secondary information about the field that you're governing. I mean, there's a lot of ways to gather that information. And it doesn't just happen once, right? So it's like saying, okay, yeah, this year we're going to do, this work with this group, and we're going to continue to gather that information. We're going to debrief on what we've learned. We're going to make sure we record that so that the next time we go to decide, what results should this organization be producing, we have that information to draw on. But it is a revolving, it's a continuous job. It's not a job you do once. So, but yeah, talking to people never hurt. Thing is, it's also really important to not confuse this, and I'll work with boards that confuse engaging with their members with having conversations at the AGM. I'm going like, that's not really linkages or engagement, that's conversation, right? It's like, or we sent out a communique, but that's not linkage either, right? It's not just a one-way street. So
building those bridges, building the channels and the forums and the opportunities, and having those occur ongoing, but lots of ways where people can be sending their values.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I was going to say there's one other thing that I think is unique in sport, or unique is a unique aspect of sport that you have to pay attention to when you're thinking about how do we govern this, is that the sport system has so many moving parts, right? Is that it's a context where, the CEO lives in that world 24/7, is often seen as more expert, right? Or more informed than volunteer board members. So if you combine that with some of the shorter tenures of board members, it's really easy to shift into a situation where the board defers to the CEO, or the CEO starts to, as I call it, manage up, right? Like, I need to manage my board so that it's doing the right things. I'm going, it's not your job. But, and so that's really a characteristic. I talked about those zones. That's really a characteristic of that amber zone, where risk management and planning are being CEO led and board approved. And so the board stays in this reactive mode as opposed to being proactive and setting that direction. So I think that's, something else that's unique. And the other thing I forgot to mention too is all of the stakeholders are so many of the stakeholders that NSOs, PTSOs, etc., are often really dependent on government and multi-sport funding and programs in order to actually produce the results that are delivered. So I think it's really easy to confuse, as I call it, who's setting direction here, right? So in how do you translate, how do you translate members' priorities and values into direction, and appreciate that all the other stakeholders have their own interests as well, right? And that they set there's criteria to be met and legitimate, right? Is to say here's standards to be achieved, etc. In exchange for the funding that we provide. And I find this in organizations that are significantly dependent on particularly government funding, that they often see the government as, if you will, the shareholder. And I'm going, yeah, no, they're not they're a stakeholder. But as soon as you're not doing, your interests don't match, yeah, they're gone, right? Or they stop funding. So it's
and so,
anyway, so I think those make it really, really interesting to do that,
yeah. And so the CEO, it's a CEO's job, with staff's job, to try to fulfill those criteria set by the funding in order to get the funding, but it's the board's job to ensure that that happens, because they have a duty to the members to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like, make this happen without abrogating or violating any of the standards or requirements that the, funders or multi-sport agencies, et cetera, have of us, right? Don't allow that. And then prove to us that that's not happening, right? So.
Yeah, proof. Okay,
Yeah.
those are those checks and balances. And again, if we set up a very clear process for monitoring, it's just like, again, educating, there are these opportunities for the student to demonstrate or the athlete to demonstrate their skills.
Yeah.
And but they've been set up for success instead of it feeling like they're being torn down or criticized.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are some pitfalls? What are some other pitfalls you've touched?
Oh, I think we've talked about that. I said probably the one thing, maybe something I haven't talked about yet is that and I said this in the beginning, is the myth that governance in sport is so unique, it needs to reinvent governance. And we hear this in every context we walk into, whether it's foundations or it's credit unions or it's hospitals or it's, mortgage investment corporations, whatever it is we're so unique. And we've never found that to be true. Do you need to tailor the application of principles to an organization? Absolutely. But do you need to reinvent governance or a principles-based system? No. It's kind of, it's like principles of training. Like, if you're training an athlete in skiing or swimming or boxing, they're like the principles of training. In physiology, I get myself into trouble here now, or, mental health preparation, they're not different. Are they tailored to the sport that you're working in? Absolutely. But
beautiful. Principles stay the same. Love it. And I have this question about, I've been doing a study on the side, and Gretchen Kerr's done so much work in this area. It's just been so fabulous to dig in and see how much, just like you, how much you've had an impact on sport and its development and growth, and Peter Donnelly and Bruce Kidd. But there's one quote I pulled out that there's this kind of attitude that sport is above, it's supreme, it's exempt, it shouldn't be subject to the same kinds of oversight concepts or principles. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's not I would probably say that characterization is something I have observed, right? It's that same as being, it's so unique and so different and so special. And it's like, yeah, no, it's unique about lots of things. I thought a lot of things need to change. I read Dina LaRoche's sport law blog maybe it was in the spring sometime, and I thought there was a pretty interesting approach, which was really saying, what we need right now is a commission of inquiry into the state of Canadian sport, recognizing that systemic issues require a systemic response. And I think that would be brilliant. It's just I'm not sure it'll happen in the shorter term. And so if I'm sitting on a board, I'm going, what do we do? So we know, and some of this stems out of organizational culture, that sense of superiority is part of a cultural ethos, if you will. But organizational culture doesn't change overnight, but it's set by tone at the top. And so if you're the board, it's like having the moral courage to acknowledge that what's happened is unacceptable, right? It's that we at the end of the day, we're accountable for that. We are 100% accountable for 100% of what happens in the organization. And that while we need a long-term strategy, we need to take some action in the short term. So it's start by acknowledging that recognizing that if this culture exists because of the way we've been doing things for many years, that doing things in the same way, even if we change the people, doesn't offer much guarantee for change. But it's sometimes that's helpful because new people actually are willing to make changes and to do things differently. So, don't dismiss that as a first step. But if I were on a board, I'd probably just start by looking at look at itself, like figure out, figure out. Boards shouldn't assume they need to figure this out on their own. There are lots of people who deal with, how do we shift culture in the organization? More problematically is that boards say, CEO, go figure this out and then tell us what to do. So I just encourage a board to really engage in some kind of substantive, intentional way of thinking about how do we engage with those on whose behalf we're governing. So our shareholder members but also the other stakeholders, our athletes, our coaches, others that are impacted by the work that we do, whether those are schools or clubs or, educational institutions. Ask them questions like, what would the sport look like 5 years from now if the values of safety and fairness and inclusiveness and transparency were fully evident throughout the sport? And I think you'd have some pretty interesting conversations.
And I love your reference to really just taking it on, being accountable. The buck stops here. And if we're 100% accountable for everything, then how do we set the tone? I think it counteracts this supremacy or we're exempt attitude. So I think that happens for good reasons, that we're in a, very highly contested space where people are trying to be the best, but really sport is about care and responsibility and doing your best. So embodying that. And we got Patrick Levis in the chat kind of reflects this in his comment about leading by example, right? And leading by example, and the board, that's where it begins. Okay, beautiful.
Yeah.
So we've got people on the line, I'm sure, and I know because I hear from people all the time, but what about my board at my club or my province or wherever they are?
Oh, yeah.
Is there like a little checklist, or can Rose give us, something? And you already have. You've given so many questions and principles and concepts. What you just phrased about, what will we look like in 5 years if the values of are evident? Beautiful. That's a beautiful strategic planning process question, right? To get them going and their way forward. What else? So
what would I ask? I mean, we have a series of questions that we ask boards if we start with, and so number one is and these are all about how confident are you, right? So how confident are you that all of the elements in your governance work as a system and are custom fit to your organization? Then we ask them, so how confident are you that the way the board organizes itself and its time, right, makes it possible for them to deliver the most value that it can? Like, we often talk about boards adding value, but boards can't add value if they're spending their time talking about things that matter today, right? That's staff work. So another question we ask is, if you ask those on whose behalf you're governing, are you confident, or how confident are you that they would say your decisions are wise and reflect the diversity of their values? Right? So on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you think you are? How confident are you that the staff that work for you believe they have the authority and know the limits within which they can apply their experience and expertise to achieve results, and don't have to come to you to get permission first? Okay. So another question that we ask is, how confident are you that all of your policies are being followed or being implemented? What data have you seen? What evidence have you seen? Not activity reports, right? Like, we're replete with activity reports. If I look at board meetings, board packages, and they have like reports from everywhere, and the first half of the meeting is all the reports, and you're going, yeah, if you're supposed to be looking into the future and what you're doing is reading reports, you are 100% focused on the past. So 50% of your meeting, you're focused on what's already happened. Probably spend another 20% on what's happening today, and you spend very little, if any, time thinking, right, eyes ahead. And what role did those reports play? Like, I've heard about this idea of monitoring, and we're demonstrating evidence, but it's not just activities, it's here's how we're demonstrating that we're fulfilling as staff. Yeah, it's saying, here's when we implement your policy, this is what it looks like operationally. This is how you'll know it's happening. Here's the way in which we measure that, right? And then here's the evidence that that's actually being achieved or happening. Yeah. So it's so some of the other questions we ask is how confident are you that your board understands the extent and the significance of current and potential future risks facing your organization? How much time have you engaged with, others from outside the organization, or even other people saying, like, have you looked at, if you're thinking about, information security down the road, or if you're thinking about the complex. Like there was a really interesting report, and I'm trying to remember who it was produced by, Global Sport or whatever, that looked at the potential for, you know, professional sports and professionally, you know, like I'm not going to call them contrived, but kind of sports that are tailored for something else, actually supplanting, if you will, Olympic kind of sport. And I thought that was a really interesting report, but nobody that I knew in sport had actually, not that many people had actually read that. I'm going, yeah, you might want to be thinking about that as a potential, not saying that that's going to happen, but how ready are you, right? Like, what are you doing in your organization to think about how would you actually create a preferred future? What do you need to be doing? What kinds of decisions do you need to make today to work towards that instead of, you know, just letting things happen, right? So let me see. Yeah. So same thing goes for, you know, alternative futures that might face those that are involved. Like what might be the world of the future for, you know, for athletes or for coaches, etc. And then looking at itself, like how confident are you your board's developing the leadership it needs to ensure that your organization will continue to be relevant and to thrive in the longer term. And then my abstract is here is, if you're less than 100% confidence, call me, right? So
Exactly.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sure a lot of people will be.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. And what about the small ones? You know, I row at a club every day, and I know, you know, it's all volunteers. Is that
Absolutely.
what you do?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. So I think, you know, boards in smaller organizations are often volunteer led. They do both jobs, right? They govern and they manage. And I would say start by just knowing that there's a difference between governing and managing. They're different jobs. You need them both. They're complementary. And then schedule time that allows you to do management work, right? Which is going to take up a lot of the time, right? Like, how do we plan, you know, the next meet that's coming up? How do we get coaches? How, et cetera, right? You're going to focus on that, but set aside time either at each meeting or, you know, every quarter or every 6 months to say, this is our governance meeting now of our board. And here's what we're doing is we're focusing on the future. We're going to, you know, we're going to actually talk to some of our other members about, you know, what they see the club becoming in 5 years from now. You know, they, you know, ask them those kinds of questions. It's like, if we were meeting again in 5 years, what would have had to have happened for you to be satisfied or excited about the impact the club has had on its members and families? And just say, we're going to have that conversation, you know, in a variety of different ways. And in April of this year, we're going to sit down and say, here's what we learned from that, right? And what does that mean about, you know, our plans for the longer term? So just differentiate those and make time for both. And I would say is when you delegate, whether it's for committees or, you know, lead volunteers or for part-time staff or whatever, is delegate what's the results they're supposed to produce and then hold them accountable to provide, you know, make sure that they're actually have done what you ask them to do in the way, you know, without being unethical and imprudent. People get tired of me saying that. And then I'd say, you know, the part about just remember that the board is 100% accountable for 100% of what happens. Pay attention. At the end of the day, as I always say, and this happens, I mean, I've read this more often than I care to think about, is that boards will say, we didn't know that was happening. And I'm going, and that is the problem, right? So it's, you know, I don't know. I just think that keeping in mind that achieving excellence in governance it's not unlike the formation of a high-performing athlete or team. Is it takes time, it takes patience, it takes knowledge, it takes investment of finances and brains and emotions. It's a journey that has lots of steps. It's not magic. It's hard work. And just like, you know, coaching is the key to an athlete's performance. I mean, I would be risked to say coaching is the key to board performance as well. So, yeah. Lots to keep in mind.
But brilliant and so helpful. And this is recorded, of course. And so people will be able to come back and listen again to sections. And I think what you've done is given such a beautiful oversight, but also translated that into on the ground. This is what you can do at your club or or, more broadly, if you're sitting on an NSO board or something in sport. I think you've done a great job too of differentiating between and using language people relate to, even though it's very corporate, right? Shareholder makes sense though, but we're also customers. But then there are these stakeholders and who's accountable to them. And I love that. I'm sure people have more questions that they can poke in, but I definitely have a few more if you don't mind.
Okay.
There's something I hear often about one voice. What does that mean? One voice on a board.
Yeah, one voice on a board. This is interesting because it's often misinterpreted, right? It's one of those things. It's like that short phrase, and here's what it means. So lots of boards think that it means that the board has made a decision, and nobody can disagree with it once they go outside of the board room, which is not what one voice means. What one voice really means is that the board makes a decision, right, as a whole, and either typically, votes on it or writes it down in policy or writes it down in emotions, says this is the decision that the board as a whole has made. It's okay unless your sort of the code of conduct that you have as a board says, no, once we've made a decision, we expect all of us to support that decision. That's a board choice. It's not what a principle of one voice means. One voice means we've made a decision as a whole and we're going forward. And so and that board members need to respect the authority of the board to have made that decision. So board members can go out and say, like, this is the decision we made. We have, the board has the authority to make that decision. I have a slightly different point of view, but I respect the board's authority.
I respect the board's authority. And it was arrived usually through robust discussion.
Yeah.
And you've got all these,
Yeah, it should have been, yes, for sure.
Should have been. We should be able to demonstrate that it has been too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I saw a hand up by Lucinda. So I wonder if Lucinda, if you want to, come on in. You can turn on your, thank you. Go ahead. And you should be able to unmute.
Oh, there we go. I'm unmuting myself now. Oh, lovely. Well, I can just tell you're a force to deal with, Rose. Just seeing you. It's amazing. And you just bring such a great topic to light. I guess I have a couple of questions. I don't want to take up everybody's time, but I think one thing I find, particularly at the local sport level, where really the rubber hits the road on when children get to enter sport and participate in sport, it's really a self-regulated system. Mm-hmm. And there's bylaws and there's a certain amount of things, but generally the ebb and flow of clubs is based on who is at the board level at a given time. Mm-hmm. And how do we create consistency in sport and that forward vision that you were talking about within sport? Yeah. Under those constraints or those realities. And then I find it's getting worse because parents have less and less time to volunteer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everywhere. I mean, that is actually a pretty profound problem, and across at least certainly Western societies, there is less and less people willing to volunteer. So, I mean, this is not an easy answer. It's not a simple answer. I mean, I think some of it comes from one, as I always say, write it down, like write down what your club wants to make happen for its members, this year, next year, down the road. All right. Secondly is be really good or conscientious about providing an orientation for new board members, right? For those that come on, make sure that they understand how you work, what you want to accomplish, and what their role is. So do that. Try to do some, board education and board development work to appreciate here's what our role is, and that it's not just, yes, it is, we're contributing our time and our energy and we're wanting to make a difference, but there's also some important legal responsibilities, right? That if, it goes back to we didn't know what was happening. Well, the judge in the litigation is going to go, yeah, too bad. You ought to have known, right? And so you become, there is liability. Fortunately, there's also directors and officers insurance, but I think it's doing some of the simple things of write things down, try to maybe extend terms, I mean, if you have to have fewer people who are on the board, but you've got a consistency in that, you're probably in better shape. But I said, it's just reminding yourselves that you're not just managing things, you're also governing for the future. And so just really simple things like agendas, right? Like agenda says, here's our management agenda, now here's our governance agenda. Or set aside one meeting a year that you're doing, governance work for the longer term, and know that because boards are often, they make decisions and then they delegate to themselves the work, right? So it's like, how do we hold ourselves accountable for what we did or what we're doing? Does that makes sense? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
okay.
Go on and on, but I really appreciate your answer, and it'll help us take it to our support organization. So really appreciate it, and really appreciate, Jennifer, you facilitating. So thank you.
Well, it's such a pleasure. Okay, and we have another 15 minutes. Is that all right, Rose? For you still?
Yeah.
And anyone I know sometimes people only have an hour and then they pop off, but again, they'll be recording after. But if you have questions, you can put your hands up, or you can put in the chat, or I can just keep peppering Rose with things, because of course that's on the list. And so while I'm waiting for hands to come up, or maybe something will spark for you, or people write in the chat, strategic planning. So how often should a board, revisit? What role does a strat plan play? You and I have had this chat about.
Yes. Okay. Here's my short answer. Strategic plans are a management tool.
Okay.
And so does that mean that boards aren't involved? Because oftentimes they're people who have, good knowledge of the sport, et cetera, have lots of, to bring and can contribute to the development of the plan, but it is a management tool, and it ought to be, it's the CEO's tool, if you will, for accomplishing the results that the board has said the organization should have, or the impact that the organization should have. So we get confused, because if you look at strategic plans, there's such a mix of outcomes and how-tos, right? Like, so there's a lot of how-to in that plan. And so I look at, the board's work is to say, here's what's to be accomplished and here's why.
Right.
And not here's how, because that leads to boards starting to say, this is how we're going to do this, or this is the program we're going to do, or this. It might be that that's a good idea, but it starts to have that role overlap, right? And that role confusion about who's actually driving the operations or the management of the organization.
So vision and values are central to the board's role, and then unpacking that into operational planning is more, that's when the CEO generate that, use that to demonstrate again, like we could revisit it and go, okay, how are we doing on inclusion? Because inclusion is important, because equity is important, but that's what we need for our organization.
Yeah, we have a vision of a sport that's inclusive and represents a diversity of opportunities, and that is safe and fair and produces mentally healthy, physically healthy people, etc. It's not a very good articulation, but it is that this is it. And it might be, there might be some more specific outcomes. Like I like visions that talk about what difference are we going to make for the people that we want to make a difference to, not about we're going to be a brilliant organization and world recognized. And I'm going, yeah, so what?
I love your phrases of, and questions, what difference will we make? And also that idea of delegate results. I think that's such a helpful concept. So then the CEO operationalizes that. I've seen CEOs then reference it and bring it back to the board and go, see, here's how we're matching up here, what we're doing in relation to what we said we would. Okay, cool. Lucinda's got another question for us.
Oh, I see a question in the.
Might be on her phone.
Yeah, I see a question just from
there we go.
Chris. Oh, okay.
So, sorry, answer Chris's question first.
Okay. So Chris's question was, and probably you can read, there's a few references to using data. And what's the source of the data? Well, it depends on what what result or what limitation you're actually trying to provide evidence of. So if you're, if you're looking at, what does I'm trying to think of something I can actually do off the top of my head here. If I were talking about, don't allow staff to be, to provide for, lack of safety, et cetera, I might say, what does safety look like, right? So it might look like we've operating procedures for emergencies. We have, out travel insurance that covers when people travel. We have this, these are the things that are in place, right? This is what it will look like that staff can operate in a system of safety. This is brilliant. So I might provide you an example later, but so then you'd go to say, well, what's the source of data? Well, it might in fact be, what do those policies cover? When was this implemented? When was the last time we actually went through emergency procedures? And so that starts to demonstrate that. So data depends on what you're trying to demonstrate has been accomplished or what limitations you're observing.
And it raises the point of that intentional collection of that data too, that there's some kind of process in place where the reporting is that process, gathering the data. We have no accidents for 10 years, because we have all these things in place. Here's some data to demonstrate that because we've been tracking it intentionally. Yeah. I love how it all meshes. Well, and interestingly, that'll be our next webinar. I'm hoping is this idea of how do we, because we just had a big conversation about safe sport. How do we know we've got a good, safe, healthy environment? So what are the indicators? What are the measures? What are the evidence? We have these policies in place for surveilling the environment, but what are we doing to make sure that it's actually whole and healthy?
Yeah. What does safe actually look like, right?
Yeah, it's a great exercise. Lucinda, you're up.
Yeah, well, thank you. No, I find that it always seems to trickle from the top down of governance, right? So if the international governance is challenged, it trickles down to the national governance, which trickles down to the PSO, which trickles down to the local clubs. And from a local level, or just where we just have like a regional impact, how can we help that out?
What are you trying to change? Like what's?
Oh, I think fairness and equity in sport.
Okay, all right, yeah. So this is it's an interesting question. I would say that it is is one of the other unique things about the sport environment is that there is most sports have international federations that set out, here in order to be a member of an international federation, we only recognize one federation. We only do this. So we have, you have as I used to call them, monopolies, right? You have a monopoly right to organize this sport in this country, which is pretty unique, right? Like you don't have you don't have an alternate rowing association, right? Because you don't like the one that Jennifer's on the board of. So it's like, we're going to form another one. So how do you affect upwards? Like, I mean, part of me says you have to think about what is your range of impact, right? What can you hold yourselves accountable to make happen? So you can focus on how do we in fact look at developing, inclusivity and diversity in our club. It's one thing. How do we, bring to light, if you will, or influence other actors in this field? How do we make our provincial organization aware of, the difference in perhaps the equity, et cetera, that you've been able to achieve and what you see happening there? So you can bring that to light. Can you make them have an impact? Not necessarily. It's pretty hard to do that. I think, if you're a voting member, you can hire and fire the board. You don't like what they're doing. But it's like saying, let's choose where I can have an impact, and let's also understand how I can create influence, right? And perhaps influence change to happen. But can I make that change happen? Yeah, probably not.
we're watching some huge issues unfold across the media in sport. And I was mentioning in our pre-conversation about, I just was reading Rick Westhead's article on a couple of provincial associations calling for resignations of the board chair and the CEO at gymnastics. And it's interesting to me that they're trying to influence, they're trying to have impact. What are your thoughts on that? And on the other hand, you look at Hockey Canada, where they're completely intact and the wagons are circled. One seems to be calling for their head.
Things have gone silent at the moment. I think what I see in this is an expression that when members are calling for that, or members being unhappy with, what I'd say is that there's a real disconnect between the values of PTSOs, what they expect, what their priorities are, what their values are, and what they see happening. And so the immediate reaction is, okay, well, we need to get rid of the people, right? Which is, fair enough. If you were in California, you could recall the people and 75% vote. But I think it is members saying, is appreciating that we actually have the power to make that change. We are, but it's recognizing that in fact you have that authority. Because as a membership as a whole, you give that authority to the board to govern on your behalf in a way that's consistent with your values and priorities. And if there's inconsistencies that exist, then you need to think about, so how do we actually make that happen? So it goes back to that question, well, how do I make that happen? So I maybe organize I'm not suggesting this, like a PTSO revolt, right? Like call a special, look at your bylaws and find out what authorities you actually have. I mean, you can call a special meeting. There are ways to do that. You could, require it, would ask for a variety of things. You could hold I'm not sure. You'd have to look at your bylaws about what you could do. But I think even just saying, like, we're not happy with those that we see to be leading, although I don't, I always say chairs are just one member. They're an equal among a group, right? Like they have, usually special authorities and special responsibilities, but they are one of equals. And so, sometimes changing the chair the chair is not wholly responsible for the board. So, but I think it's an expression. There are some real significant disconnects here between what's happening, more about how things are being done than about maybe what results are being produced, but in a way that's unacceptable, because it's seen to be either, in many cases I see, seem to be unethical, sometimes imprudent, but sometimes both.
And I'm a big fan of education, and you've turned to educating boards. And can you speak just in our last minute or so to the impact you feel that you're having? You've worked with hundreds of boards and bringing in, so, like you say, you can ditch a person off the board, but will that actually change? And is that really the problem, or is it more this lack of understanding, which I think is a gap in sport, We don't necessarily always understand everything you've been sharing with us today. So it's on educating boards.
Well, I mean, I think that the impact is pretty profound. I mean, I think that, we see organizations, what you see is, here's the feedback from the organizations that we work with, most of whom we work with for years as opposed to days, right? Like we spend a lot of time over time with boards that, consistently we work with as they get better and more skilled. So I think there's a huge impact, and there's a huge demand for boards understanding what role they should be playing and how to do that. And so, I think we have, we've seen a pretty positive impact on organizations that are, clearer, more focused. Have a real sense of, what's the difference between governing and managing, and how do we do that work? How do we shape, how do we shape the future going forward? How do we spend time actually, creating future scenarios? So I feel pretty good about the work that we do and the feedback we get.
There's hope. There's one last question. And
Yep.
I think it's really probably at the heart of everything for a lot of people when they're thinking about joining a board or being on a board. What's their role? It's this idea of very clear role clarity, as you talked about, but also responsibility. And so Katrina, and you can see it in the chat there, but how can you hold the board leadership accountable for use of government funding? I feel like if I was to fill out a little test on this, I feel like I'm 100% accountable as a board member for the use of funding. I have to make sure the manager is using the funding well. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think probably what I'd be saying with that is I'd probably have a policy related to likely around financial conditions and activities that says, that spells out what would be unacceptable with respect to, non-observance of conditions for funding, for, use of funding and for purposes not served, et cetera. And then I'd be asking for, the data that demonstrates that in fact that's not happening. And if I'm not doing that, if I'm not laying out those specifications or boundaries, and I'm not asking for that evidence, I'm not doing my job, right? And so then if you come to something happens where the funds have been, misdirected or not used properly or whatever, you don't get to say, we didn't know that was happening.
And a big gap.
My response is you should have.
A big gap is the financial acuity, right? And acumen around finances, and kind of just glaze over when they start showing the reports, but we're responsible. Yeah,
you're still responsible. So, I mean, some of that is, is board education of saying, we as a board maybe aren't as, financially, literate as we ought to be. That's starting problem is we need to identify that and educate ourselves.
Right.
And we maybe need to get some, maybe we don't need to do this all on our own. Maybe we do need to get some support, but not to depend simply on, if you've recruited an accountant, you don't depend on the one accountant for all of your knowledge. You as a board need to be financially literate as a whole and figure out how to do that.
It's a real duty, a real responsibility.
Yeah. And I just think people don't understand that sufficiently. And some of it is always it's board education is interesting because I think we have a great little video that says nobody ever grew up as a kid saying, I want to be on a board. And then figured out how to do that. Lots of people end up on boards by happenstance or accident. And then, maybe proceed, but don't think about what do I need to know? What do I need to be able to do? What kinds of value should I have to be on a board? And
I feel like it's a duty, if you've been a professional for a while, you have this duty to serve and share and contribute and take responsibility, right? That I don't know that we always understand, because we often get excused as, the board are volunteering. Well, but it's a duty.
Yeah.
Kind of an honor. I have other questions, if you don't mind, a couple more.
No, sure.
Because I screwed up with technology, so we're a couple minutes late anyway. Tammy asks, staff shortages. Yeah, so you may not have the right person on staff to do the finances or HR or whatever. What can the board play a role, or what's the solution with that?
Well, so as I said, I think staff is usually should be the EDs or the CEO's responsibility if they're short of staff. So could you ask a board member to play a role in doing that? So yes, you could, if the board member recognizes that they're accountable to the CEO for their performance in that job, not to the board, and that they're not a board member in that job, they're a staff member.
And like you said earlier, just be very clear about, I'm doing management stuff right now. Now I'm
I'm not here as a board member, right? Like this is not, and same thing with planning, right? Like I'm here as someone who is passionate about the sport. I have a long history. I know a lot about, coaching and, whatever, and I'm going to provide some contribution, but I'm doing this as part of the operational planning team, if you will.
Okay.
Yeah.
really good. And when you were talking about athlete representation on the board too, and maybe there's more of it's more of a conduit, hey? The channel is maybe more important than a person that's supposed to be representing, because that is.
Mhm. Yeah, it's often the shortcut for we need to hear from athletes, so let's have an athlete on the board. That's it. It's like, yeah, no, that's not sufficient.
And yet it's being recommended hugely across so many different platforms right now that, we need more athletes on the board. But I think you're right. It's more about, I mean, as a communications person, I'm always about the forums and the channels and the processes. And Martin is the last person. He's a good buddy, but he's talking about the UCCMS as a kind of national code of conduct for safe sport. But there's one for governance, but there is, isn't there? There is an NSO governance.
Well, okay. There is one that Sport Canada has been working on. I mean, I've provided some input, I've provided some comments that I think it's evolving. But I think there are good standards out there. I mean, I would, the one that I just referenced, which is, there's probably the introduction is free. The ISO standard on effective governance for organizations is actually a very good guideline for looking at what's required of governance. Oh, you went silent here, Jennifer.
I was typing, so I didn't want to be.
Oh, okay. All right.
Posted a link to that ISO website so that they can see in a couple of those governance documents under development standards under development, the one that you've shared with me that I got as well. And then I'll put the link in for the NSO. It's on the COC website, actually. They have an NSO sharing site, which to me is a strange place to have it. But
yeah, I think they also had thought about doing, I could be wrong about this, but there was some thought that the COC was going to develop some standards for governance. But I think I'm not sure the status of that anymore.
So we'll send that out too. And I think we should probably wrap up. That's a great, what a great conversation and so much great information. And so what we do, everybody, is we post the recording to our website. It's on a YouTube. You can go back and look at old ones too, but this one will be here. We'll send it out, of course, to everyone who registered as well. And we, on the website, will include some of these links to the various resources that Rose has mentioned. As a place you can come back, and we really do want to we're an educational institution, so we want to have some resources available as well. And man, it was so great to see so many familiar faces today and names. Thanks everybody for your support, and thank you so much, Rose. That was incredible. We really appreciate the time you've shared.
All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Take care. I'll be in touch.
All right,
we'll be in touch. Take care.
All right,
bye
bye,
everybody.